We've probably spent now another 15 minutes in the panel format, and I'm going to ask you for some questions. But before I do, I'm going to get the panel to start, and I'm going to pick on Stuart to start with. What concerns you the most as a major organisation when you look at this agenda? What's at the top of your list of where you're thinking, good grief?
I think for us as an organisation, the toughest part probably was starting to talk about it. It was said earlier about how do you organise and get engagement with the executive around the subject. Now, the Modern Slavery Act probably was the catalyst for us to say, actually, we need to be talking about it. We were already doing things, but we just weren't really sharing them externally. So the transparency element of the Act and the intent is probably, I think, the thing that's going to grapple most big businesses the most. Because nobody wants to be transparent before the next person's transparent, and therefore the challenge of how do you share in a collaborative way is, I think, one of the other challenges that we're going to face.
Yeah, starting with a collaboration of one is probably a bit scary.
Yeah.
So same question then to Rosie. What's at the top of your list? What are your concerns?
I think I would totally echo that response. Really, I mean we've tried to canvass our supply chain at tier 1 level and had quite a good response in a sort of a silent vote type of atmosphere. But in terms of asking actual specific questions, some of them would respond with statements that have clearly been written by a lawyer about not needing to tell us anything about something, which immediately, raises your suspicions. So I think it is a case of you have to ask the questions, and depending on the kind of responses you get, it will, it may flavour how you would respond to those businesses in the future. But regardless, we're under a lot of pressure to deliver projects to budget and, within timescales, and there often isn't a lot of time to get beyond tier 2 and tier 3 in terms of mapping that supply chain, and without our customers being more willing to take on board some of that responsibility for the demands that they're expecting to be turned around so quickly, that joined up approach is almost impossible to deliver.
No, it's helpful. Anyone from the floor with questions? Great panel here. Yes, at the front. We'll take a couple. So one here and then Chris. So
Ross Daines from FSI. I'm interested in the pre-competitive space and contracting processes. Neil Wilkins of the IHRB referred to stage 1 and 2 of the Dakar principles, the recruitment of workers, and how companies struggle to reach into that space and to get visibility of what's going on. And my experience of talking to Middle Eastern construction companies is that they feel hopeless in terms of trying to have some control over how the labour, particularly the migrant labourers, are coming to them. Is there anything that can be done in the contracting process which can provide the space for visibility and provide a mechanism for people to have more control about how migrant labourers get into their work system?
Okay, that's a helpful question. So, Chris, you want to answer as well? So,
yeah, on the issue of reputational risk, really, having been to UK Construction Week a couple of weeks ago, and everyone sort of seems to be almost talking down the industry. We're terrible, we can't get people in, and what have you. And we have such a low impression of ourselves. I just wonder whether the whole idea of reputational risk is not really something that sits very high in the construction industry, because we think so bad of ourselves anyway.
So two quite contrasting things. So one is there room in the procurement process essentially to get these issues on the table early, and have we kicked ourselves in the shin so hard it's utterly hopeless? Who wants to respond to that? Yeah, go
if
for
I
it.
take the reputational risk one, I disagree. I think it is actually a huge concern for us as an organisation. I think most businesses that have brands will be concerned. I think I'd also come from the place where most big businesses or most businesses will also want to do the right thing, and it was said earlier where actually they're just not sometimes sure where to start. So I think the reputational risk issue is up on the agenda, and if I'm honest, is probably talked about more frequently than most things in our organisation, particularly around the executive. I think the challenge was mentioned earlier. How does that challenge get met when it filters further away from the executive? So when it's on the shop floor, when it's somebody else in your business or your supply chain, and the intent of the legislation to say, actually, if it's my supply chain and my second, third, fourth tier suppliers, actually, I have no idea what they think about my reputational risk. In fact, I'm fairly certain I know what their response would be. They don't really care. Because that's not what they're thinking about when they're supplying to their supplier.
Yeah, okay.
Just a comment about the procurement terms and conditions. One of the things that we find with companies is that you've got the ethical trade people or sustainability people sitting in one part of the shop. You've got your human resources department, which seems to have sort of no sense quite often of ownership or responsibility for human resource policies. What terms are workers being recruited under, and what rights do they have in terms of their working conditions, as well as obviously all the risks around debt bondage and the way they are recruited. But indeed it covers a whole range of areas around their wages, around their hours, around their choices, and so on. And in another part of the shop, you've got the procurement practices, and then in another part, you've got your risk management people sitting in the legal departments. And quite often, they're just not talking to one another, and there's completely contradictory messages going through the same company. And so what we are seeing happily amongst some companies with the Modern Slavery Act prompting some of that is cross-departmental task teams, is a greater ownership of human resources in driving these practices, so that procurement systems in terms of price and volume and quality and time and so on that are procured into the system are aligned somehow with what is it that you are requiring of companies, and indeed what are the suppliers' understanding of their own, what is their capacity and understanding of the human resources requirements that are at stake here? How do you keep decent records of payroll, of hours, of wages and so on? So what we find is that there is here's my code, just make sure that you comply with it, sign on the dotted line, I think as others have said, and push that risk all the way down without understanding and assessing what is the capacity for those suppliers, and what are their systems and structures in the recruitment process, as well as in the human resource practicing and everything else.
So Chris, do you think there's a space here for activity from the National Standards Body in terms of procurement best practice, taking into account some of the things we talked about? So, the bit early part to discuss these things, collaborative working within departments in the organisation, leading to better results?
Gosh, that's not actually the question I was thinking about answering. I was very interested in your question. I think
you can answer bridge control and go from my bit to your bit. You'll be right.
Right. I'll try and bridge. I've been in the space now for 20 years, not with standards. I've actually managed, developed and implemented programs for corporates, national and international corporates, for the last 20 years, and everything that I've heard today really rings true. There are two questions that I've been faced with by my commercial colleagues over the last 20 years, and they come up time and time again. And the first question is this issue a real issue? And I can say, having worked in Latin America, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia and the Middle East, yes, it's a real issue, absolutely. And not only is it a real issue, but to echo, I think, Neil's point earlier on, it's an abhorrent issue as well. The second thing that I hear time after time after time is this our problem? We're not a charity. And I would, really the thing that comes through very strongly for me is absolutely it's our issue as a corporation, because there's a financial penalty attached for getting this stuff wrong. $430 million worth of investment was pulled out of Walmart in 2006 by the Norwegian pension fund. It's the largest pension fund in the world. They pulled $430 million worth of investment out of Walmart. I was in the team at the time. It prompted some very painful discussions. Some of the stats. The Sloan School of Management at MIT carried out a study over 3 decades looking at the correlation between stock value and corporate social responsibility programs, and they concluded every time a company gets this wrong, every time there's an eco-negative event, stock value falls by 0.65%. The Ethical Investment Research Service, EIRS, they concluded that every time there's an eco-negative event, it affects stock value, share value by between 0.5 and 3%. Not only did Walmart in 2006 lose the Norwegian pension fund, but they've also lost in the intervening years AB funds, Sweden's AP funds, Netherlands ABP, Dutch PGGM, and M&N Service. So there is a financial penalty for getting this stuff wrong. And I think, if we're going to leave this room thinking about the Modern Slavery Act, I would just ask that we don't think of it in terms of standards, that we don't think of it in terms of compliance with legislation, but actually we think about this in terms of governance. These programs that everybody's been discussing today ultimately are about managing risk. We talk to our colleagues in those terms and we'll get the response that we're looking for. And again, everything that I've heard today, I think it gives me a great deal of confidence, in fact, that we're moving in the right direction.
So I think just to tie it all together, I'm going to ask everybody what good looks like in this space and what you think you could look at and go, do you know what, we've made progress. And I'm going to start with you because you just said what we shouldn't do. So in no more than 3 sentences, Chris, what will good look like for construction in the space of modern slavery?
I think a lot has been talked about collaboration and collaborative efforts. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, I think, are terrific. More than that, though, I think structure. Treat this as a business issue. This is not a philanthropic exercise. We know how to address business issues. We know how to address other business issues. This is a business issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. David, would you like to offer a view? What does good look like?
Two parts to that question. With regard to labour providers, I can answer that very easily. You can all contact me for a responsible use of labour providers in your supply chain document, which lays out very clearly what good looks like. With regard to modern slavery, 2 points. Having someone on your senior board with an explicit responsibility for mitigating the human rights risk in their business and supply chain, and having a multifunctional operational team for implementing good practice to meet the requirements of the Modern Slavery Act and to drive the actions needed to combat slavery in the business and supply chains.
Thank you. Cindy, what does good look like? 2 sentences this time.
Well, one that hasn't been spoken about, because I agree with all of that, is workers actually organised and able to negotiate their own terms and conditions. Where workers are organised, the risks of modern slavery are much less. Their ability to have some agency on all of these things will obviate the need for tons of audits and risk management tools and all sorts of things. And it's the one thing that most companies are slightly allergic to, is the idea, well, very allergic to, I have to say, and most governments, is trade unions. And I know that unions aren't everywhere where you need them, but where they exist, they effectively engage in an industrial relationship with their employers to address these issues.
2 very long sentences. Please don't do that. You've got to get better at this. Richard.
Yeah, very quickly, one word we haven't heard of yet is the use of incentives in companies. So I think I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest challenges is embedding it from top down. Well, actually, incentives are unbelievably powerful. And also the use of disincentives as well. You get this wrong, it's going to hurt. And also, I think the other way is translate this into a business case as well. So it's absolutely risk gets the management board interested, but actually getting lower management interested in how can this drive positive performance. Now that's the clever bit here. And we've seen evidence that it actually generates greater performance profitability.
Ian.
I think it's about the collaboration and seeing this embedded in the business. So what I was saying earlier about it's not just another silo, another box to tick. Get it embedded in everything you do in the business, whether that's governance, training, risk assessment, etc. And I think the other thing is getting a culture change from that you don't talk about this until you think you're perfect. And I think the media have got a big role to play in this. We're all so scared of an expose from an investigative journalist says you've got something wrong. And as I talk to other people internationally, there seems to be something different about UK media to media in other parts of the world. They don't do that. So I think there's something about culture change, and we've got to be brave to say, look, this is what we are doing. We're not perfect, and not be afraid of the journalists.
Thank you, Ian. Stuart, you need to complete the sentence. Good is when?
We improve on what we're currently doing.
Eloquent. And the last word, Rosie?
That's so unfair. I'd like it to be everybody's responsibility, right down to the guys on site. They understand what the Modern Slavery Act is, and they know how to spot the signs and call the hotline number and be free from fear of retaliation from a gangmaster to them personally if they spot something is wrong.
Thank you. Well said. Can we give a round of applause to our panel, please?